Ville, you're now here with us, and
Hey Villa, nice to meet you.
Hey, nice to see you too, Dexter.
so I'll let you take over, Ville. You're hosting this one.
It's also really good to see like a professional podcaster being a guest because Dexter's sound is really good compared to some of the other guests that we maybe had in the past.
There's nothing more frustrating as there when all that time that you have to spend in post-production trying to make sure the audio sound reasonable.
But you've moved your camera now. We're looking at your garden. We're looking at your neighbour's roof, I think it is.
No, I think it's like a window or something.
No, it's the neighbour's roof. We're looking through a window at the neighbour's
Through a
roof.
window, yeah, through the shades, the blinds. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I think it would make an interesting talking point for the episode, but maybe it would be better if we actually had, our guest front and centre rather than the neighbour's roof. And how's your head, Ville?
So far so good. I mean, if I collapse and bleed to death, I'll just blame you, Paul. So that's simple as that.
You can do that. So you didn't wake up with your brains all mushed across your bed.
No. Luckily, they were all in the bandages. So
they were all in the brains were in the bandages. So you took off the bandages and the brains fell out, and now you're just talking from a zombie state.
Without brains, bleeding to death, and I'll blame you. So that's the long story short.
Listeners. Ville is just as coherent without a brain as he is with a brain.
Any questions from you, Dexter?
No, I'm good to go.
All right, Paul, good to go?
Absolutely, let's go for it.
Okay, good.
Welcome to Fintech Daydreaming, the podcast that dives into the world of banking technologies and the ever-changing landscape of fintech companies. We bring you real-life examples from global and local thought leaders, as well as experts working within the financial industry, and seek out the best stories from the front lines of financial services innovation, where dreams of industry pioneers meet reality. Hosted by Paul Krogdahl and Ville Sontu. This is Fintech Daydreaming.
Hello and welcome to Fintech Daydreaming again, dear listeners. My name is Ville Sointu and I will be your host for today's episode of this fintech goodness. But as always, I couldn't do this by myself. I never can do podcasts by myself, at least, and that's why I have my friend Paul with me here. So how are you today, Paul?
I'm mixed. I'm mixed, I would say. I mean, first of all, it's fantastic to hear that you cannot do a podcast without me. And I'm assuming that means any podcast in the future. So if you get invited as a guest onto a podcast, I'm assuming I'm going to be invited with you as a sort of extra attachment to you. It will be the Ville and Paul show on any podcast you go on in the future. But on the mixed part, I actually started the day with a letter from the Finnish police.
Oh,
Which I thought was fantastically intriguing until I opened it and they said you've been speeding. So, now it has turned into a €200 fine that I need to pay, and it demonstrates that it isn't that good to own a Porsche.
yeah, okay. Fair enough.
But apart from
at least it wasn't about the financial crime part, so we're happy that it's just a speeding thing.
Yes, they haven't caught up with that part yet. It's purely just about my speeding and my lack of responsibility on the highways in Finland.
Indeed. And as far as the podcasting alone thing goes, I think fair enough. I always need a comic relief or a sidekick, so I think that's we can agree on that. So let's keep that one. Good, but enough about that. Let's get on to the show. Of course, it's all about our guests as always. And today we're going to have a really interesting conversation because we're going literally to the other side of the world for our guest today. Our guest today is joining us all the way from Australia. Dexter, how are you doing today?
I'm very good, Villa. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for having me on, Paul.
Good to have you with us. So again, as always, we asked our guests to introduce themselves. So why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and what takes you to Australia, and finally, what is your superpower?
Yeah, cool. So I'm Dexter Cousins. I'm founder of Tier 1 People. We're Australia's probably most known and kind of leading executive search firm for fintech. So we've helped businesses like Revolut, Klarna, TrueLayer, 10x all launch in Oz, as well as help a lot of the Australian domestic fintechs scale and expand. I'm also host of Fintech Chatter podcast, which is Australia's #1 fintech podcast and has been going for about 3 years. Originally from the UK, north of England, but moved to Australia in 2004. Been in the recruitment game for about 25 years. In Australia, so the first, up until about 2013, 2014, was working very much with banks, financial institutions, and insurers. And then 2016, I actually launched Tier 1 People, which was based, I guess, exclusively around servicing fintech. We didn't really have a fintech industry back then. Indeed, when I launched the business, we didn't even have a governing body. We launched just before Fintech Australia. But what I could see was, having come from the UK, what was happening there within fintech. And Australia has always been a little bit behind, or traditionally has been a bit behind by about 5 years. So it kind of set the business up very much with the view that it might take a couple of years, but that we'd be in a really strong position. And that kind of turned out to be the case. I think I remember Cybos in 2018, which was at Sydney. And that was the kind of defining moment where I went home to my wife and said, hey, I think we've backed the right horse. This is, going to be huge. And it has. And I think since, certainly 2018 in Australia, fintech has, continued to evolve and grow at a rapid rate, where now it's a standalone industry. We've had, special governors within the government and ministers for fintech. And it's seen as, I think, very much one of the streams of innovation, but also, I guess, investment coming into the country. So a lot of support from government and politicians as well, which is really cool to see. I know you're going to ask me for a joke.
Yes, I am. I almost hate to break the flow, because you made some really excellent points about the Australian fintech scene, which we will deeply dive into very soon. But, I am a man of structure, so surprisingly, I suppose. But so we'd like to do the joke, which is something that our listeners have always been liking. So we cannot skip the joke. So do you have a joke for us?
I do have a joke, but it's also kind of it's a story, and it's actually something that I remind myself of daily, because it's almost like a moral tale for myself and my business. And it's the joke about the Wall Street banker who goes on holiday to Mexico. And I don't know if you've heard it. And he meets a Mexican fisherman who's just pulling up into the port, who's been out in the morning and caught a few prize tuna. And the investment banker asks, hey, kind of, why didn't you stay out there longer and catch more fish? And he says, hey, I've got enough for my wife and my kids, and a few I can give to my friends. I'm going to spend the rest of the day. I'm going to go and have a siesta, spend some time with the kids. Then I'm going to go out with my friends, play guitar, have a few drinks, and just enjoy life. And the Wall Street banker says, hey, hang on a minute. Right? What you should do is you should stay out there longer and get more fish. Why is that? Well, then you can sell the fish, right? You make a profit and you can buy more boats. Why would I do that? Well, then when you buy more boats, you can expand, right? And then you can move to the US and you can go global. He said, well, then what else then? Why would I do that? He says, well, then you can IPO. And he says, well, what would I do then? He said, well, then you're going to make millions of dollars. And he said, but what would I do then? He said, well, then you could retire to a Mexican fishing village and you could spend the morning fishing and then go and spend time with your wife and kids, go out with your friends, play guitar. So it's kind of, it's a kind of joke, but I think what I should do is maybe switch the Wall Street banker for a Silicon Valley VC, right? Because they kind of seem to be doing the same thing with founders, taking them down the path of be a unicorn. It's sell the dream. So yeah, look, that's kind of my, and I've kind of told that joke to quite a few founders, and they've laughed and said, yeah, we kind of does feel a bit like we get pressured from VC to try and be something that we're not.
But it's actually fundamentally important message in that, because it's all about being happy with what you've got and
absolutely
and not keep competing with everybody else. Compete with yourself and be happy with where you are in life.
Yeah, I mean, now, dear listeners, never say that Fintech Daydreaming doesn't give you life lessons or good advice on how to live your life, because that was exactly it. I mean,
And in the form of a joke as well, eh?
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
everything in one package. And again, then I do have to make the comment that I also we talked about briefly before we started, which is that I really enjoy having a professional fintech podcaster as a guest, because your sound quality is like absolutely fantastic. So again, I'm sure our listeners are able to appreciate that little technical detail as well. But good. So back to the Australian fintech conversation, because again, a lot of our listeners are actually European based. We have a lot of listeners in Nordics, even though we do have listeners from 30 plus countries, according to the statistics. We have a heavy European base for our listeners, and many of them might not be familiar with the Australian fintech scene to the extent that they would be able to even characterize what are the main points of Australian fintech scene, and how it might differ from the things that are happening in Europe and North America, for example. So, I mean, for someone who has never heard anything about Australian fintech, I mean, how would you describe it beyond what you already mentioned in your introduction? What are the main characteristics, if you will?
Yeah, look, I think what I would say, that summarizes Australian fintech is that I feel we're punching above our weight. So, for the size of the country, the challenges that are here, certainly when I look across the rest of the globe from an innovation perspective, I think we're up there with most others. I'd say Israel, nobody's touching Israel, but from a payments perspective, we're way ahead of the US. I think in kind of CDR, open banking, whilst we're not ahead of the UK, I think the plan is a lot more ambitious. And look, we got I think a real kind of the entrepreneurship is in the DNA. And so you've seen, I'm sure you've heard of Afterpay and Zip, two businesses that kind of just sprung out of nowhere, founded in 2014, 2015, and went on to be global, kind of organizations. So I think, we're actually a bit of a surprise package and get underestimated quite a bit, particularly when I speak with businesses who are looking to come to Australia. I think they kind of get the impression that there's not a lot of competition here, that the banks are backwards, that, there's huge opportunities, and, where the Aussie consumers are being really underserved. Interestingly, Australia has, I think, one of the greatest penetrations of smartphone usage. And we were the first country to go live with tap and go with cards, and I think about 2008. Facebook have just launched their pay per subscription or verification product, and they're using Oz as the market. And so Facebook, Amazon, and I believe Twitter have and PayPal have used Australia as the kind of launch pad for testing new ideas and innovation. It's a great, regulatory model is very, very similar, but also if it goes wrong here, nobody hears about it. So it's kind of the same place because nobody's interested in what's going on in Oz. So it's a really kind of safe place to innovate. It's a good launch pad for Asia. We're never going to usurp Singapore, I think, but as a, that kind of landing pad, or that first place where you want to go and test the product and then expand. And we've seen some organizations come to Australia first and then expand to the US. So I think that's kind of what it's got going for it. I think we've got really strong kind of sub sectors in payments. Like there's, I think probably about 60% of fintechs or some form of payments business. We're doing some interesting things in blockchain and crypto. Businesses like Immutable, which is in the gaming space, but is working at layer 2 Ethereum scaling. And then we've got, I guess, the other area is that we've got wealth management, and we've got a kind of obligatory superannuation or pension scheme where look, pretty much 10.5% of our GDP, as in everybody's salary, 10.5% of that every year has to go into a pension scheme. So I think the kind of pension market here is worth something like 3.7 trillion million Aussie dollars. The pension firms have got a lot of power. They haven't really been disrupted, and the digital experiences are pretty naff. So there's a lot of opportunities there. And then the other side that we've got is and what we're seeing is an emerging kind of space, particularly with the economy, is around business banking. So Xero, the accounting firm, they're not Australian, but they're New Zealand, so our partners. MYOB is Australian. So we've got a strong heritage in that accounting space, and we're starting to see a lot of kind of fintechs now come up with cost solutions, following a little bit of the Brex kind of model, but now evolving it. I think the neobank model has really struggled here, and it's been well documented, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one is the size of the market just doesn't kind of warrant, makes it very difficult for any consumer-led fintech to get traction and to get scale, and therefore it's just really difficult to win investment. But the other side to it is that actually Australia's big four banks, some of the best digital banks in the world. So is there actually a need? Not, there was in the UK, absolutely, before Revolut and Monzo came along, whereas the Australian banks were highly profitable coming out of the GFC and invested heavily in digital. So we didn't really see that burning platform for a consumer to switch banks. So that's a summarization of kind of where we've been and where we are.
Yeah. There's a lot of topics there I want to double click on. So let's start from the end, basically. So you mentioned that the four big banks are actually doing a fairly decent job in serving their customers and moving to digital. So that's actually quite interesting, and we see a little bit of the similar dynamics in the Northern Europe as well, Nordics specifically. Now, that is of course steering the fintech investments as well. So you might not see as many consumer-facing fintechs as you might see in other countries where the incumbent banks are not that great. But from a broader perspective, how is the cooperation between fintechs and the four major banks? Is it working out, or are they competing with each other in the non-consumer facing areas, for example? Or how is this collaboration space working between banks and fintechs in Australia?
It's a great question, and it's a one that I've been very kind of close to over the last six, 7 years. And if we were having this conversation in, say, 2017, 2018, it wouldn't be a very pleasant conversation. There was not kind of a relationship and very little collaboration, and some kind of pretty underhanded tactics from large financial institutions and banks. I'm happy to report, though, that I think particularly over the last 12, 18 months, we've seen a lot more collaboration, certainly with my client base. I'm working a lot more with the corporate venture arms of banks. And we're seeing, certainly a number of emerging startups have gone through their accelerator programs and are being really successful. So, it was difficult, but I think that, I have to kind of give a hat tip to the banks and, Commonwealth Bank and ANZ and Westpac and NAB, who've all, kind of had, I think they've had periods where, some have evolved faster than others. At present, I'd say NAB Ventures and I think Commonwealth Bank's X15 are possibly doing, most of the investing. But having said that, I think ANZ have, their ventures arm is, kind of really starting to push on again. Westpac, I think, are probably the one who's kind of a bit further behind and not as strong on the investment space as they were previously. And they split with their corporate venture fund, Reinventure, I think maybe it's 18 months back. So we just see kind of cycles where some kind of have a greater focus on it than others. Look, what is positive is I've noticed an economic downturn over the last 12 months. And as yet, I haven't seen the corporate innovation arms and kind of venture funds pull out and kind of lay off. Sure, there hasn't been as much investment, and that's cooled, but we're still seeing, and what's been very, very positive is seeing kind of, Series B rounds kicking off again, where we're seeing 30, 35, $40 million being pumped in. So, whereas previously, the last 6-9 months, it was seed rounds and Series A at $5 to $7 million. So all the early stage stuff was getting invested in. Now we're starting to see the more advanced businesses kind of getting investment again.
Quick sort of follow-on question from that. One of the things that we're seeing is, or have seen before in other regions, is a desire from the fintechs and the banks to collaborate with each other. But there's been issues with the banks having, legacy systems, their IT infrastructure not being able to cope very easily with the integration with third parties, expanding out into a wider ecosystem. You're saying that the Australian banks have been quite proactive in digital capabilities, supporting their customers with digital channels, etc. Are the Australian banks, though, struggling to a certain degree with integrating with the fintechs, or is it more being related to collaboration at a business level?
Yeah, it's a great question, Paul. And again, I think there's been a lot of kind of test and learn and iteration around this. So I'm going to use again X15 as an example. They've engaged with a couple of banking as a service providers, Mambu being one, and an Aussie business called Shape, which they've done kind of some, what I would say is kind of micro integrations for some of their portfolio companies. And then Mambu has built essentially a kind of compliance platform where any kind of startup that comes into the Commonwealth Bank ecosystem can quickly be plugged in, and from a compliance, risk, governance, security perspective, they then can potentially have access to Commonwealth Bank's 10 million customers. So look, we're starting to see like real collaboration, and I think one of the challenges that we've seen just in the fintech ecosystem over the last 12 months has been the interdependency on each other for these ecosystems. So, sadly, in mid 2022, Vault Bank went out of business and had to hand back their license. But part of their business model was similar to Starling Bank in that they had a banking as a service platform, which then meant some of the startups who were on that all of a sudden had no way, literally overnight, had no way of being able to service their customers. So I think it's kind of great that we're seeing, these kind of mini ecosystems come up, but there is a big risk that, this kind of interconnectedness just takes one of the kind of components to fall over or go out of business, and it has a real knock-on effect down the chain. But certainly, look, I think that's kind of led itself to really improve the collaboration as well, because now what you don't have are these kind of, 12-month dances with each other where, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? Startups just can't afford to waste 12 months on something potentially happening or not. So we're finding that, that we're getting to much faster no's, which is, I think, really helping kind of improve those relationships. As well as, look, I think what we've also seen is just the maturation of the fintech startup ecosystem. If I kind of take my mind back to 2015, 2016, you had a kind of, hipster and a man bun rocking up to a regulator, telling them how they were going to Uberize banking, and then you talk about, regulation and all this stuff. And what? I didn't know you had to do that. And so kind of we've had to shake that off and kind of figure and grow up, right? And have kind of grown up discussions around security and governance and risk and regulation and all of the things that you absolutely need in fintech. It's kind of, you can't come with the Facebook mantra of let's move fast and break things, because if you do that in fintech, there's a high chance you're going to end up in prison, right? So it's so we've seen that kind of, I think what's happened is everybody's kind of, the fintech industry's grown up, and I think there's been a lot more kind of appreciation and empathy and understanding, and desire from the banks to say, hey, we can't innovate like this. We just can't move this fast.
Yeah.
Right? We need somebody externally to do this for us. So it's just been fascinating to kind of watch that all evolve. And now, we're kind of starting to see some really great businesses come out of it.
Yeah, it's been a bit of almost like a cynical joke in the European banking scene that the European banks never really wanted to work with fintechs until PSD2 forced them to. So they actually had to open up their APIs. So then they had to figure out, okay, now we need to make business out of these APIs that we have to build anyway. And that speaks to the next big topic that I wanted to kind of segue to here, which you already started, which is the regulation. Now, comparing, I mean, in Europe, they always say that especially the financial services space likes to regulate things into existence. I suppose the PSD2 is an example of that. And now we're seeing the markets in crypto assets regulation probably doing the same for digital assets in Europe as well. Then on the other side of that spectrum, we have the US, who always does things first and then figures out the regulation maybe later if needed. Where is Australia in this spectrum? Do you see more resemblance to the regulate first, then do things, or break things and then figure out the regulation later? Or is it somewhere in the middle, perhaps?
Oh, we tend to copy whatever the UK does.
Okay.
Yeah, so we had the kind of digital banking license, the restricted license for neobanks, the sandbox. I think it was brave by the regulators, but also that they were prepared to see businesses fail, certainly banks fail. So I kind of certainly don't want to be overly critical, but if you look at CDR or open banking regime as an example, that's been live for 2.5 years now, and I think we've got something like 10% of banks now exchanging data. Fintechs just can't get access to the data. We've seen nothing happen from a consumer perspective on new products. And I think, look, the conversations that I've been involved in since 2018 are all around legislation and, kind of compliance, which when you consider that CDR stands for the consumer data right, there's been no kind of mention of the consumer and actually what they might want. And what are these products that you're talking about building that are going to benefit them? Because, to me, it just sounds like an aggregator site of, comparison site of, hey, here's a good deal for you. Give us your email address. So I think we're kind of starting to see what's actually interesting is, whilst the banks are really dragging their heels there, right? And it's, I think this is one area where the collaboration has not been good. And they've been allowed to do that, and some of the fines that have been dished out are just ridiculous, like $15,000 for not complying. It's kind of crazy, right? For a major bank. But what has been interesting is that CDR, the next evolution of it was to be energy, and we're actually seeing better use cases in the energy space than we are in the banking space right now. So my hope is that, maybe is what we'll see is that, and what you would like to see is that they would get the banking piece right first and then extend it out. But the ambition of trying to kind of be everything and it not just be open finance, but open everything, could be something that leads us to be highly innovative and, kind of really push that, kind of get the regulators on board and kind of, iron out all of these things early on so that it then moves very quickly. Or it could just turn into an absolute mess. It's kind of very hard to predict right now.
Interesting that you sort of mentioned that basically you do whatever the UK does. Being located where you are geographically, I would have assumed, potentially wrong, that Australia was heavily influenced by what's happening in the fintech scene and the banking scene in Singapore, Asia Pacific, potentially also in India, rather than what's happening in the UK. How much does everything that's happening over there in Singapore, etc., influence what happens in Australia? Because they're a little different in the regulation. They're a little bit further in how they deal with some of the digitization than, for instance, the UK.
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I would absolutely love for Australia to emulate Singapore. I remember going to the Fintech Festival in 2019, and I was just blown away by this kind of, what I've just talked about, CDR and open everything. Well, if you look at Singapore, this vision of being the first kind of smart city state by 2025, and how everything, that is kind of interlinked. Health, logistics, like everything around utilities, everything is interlinked. And underpinning that is fintech. And then having been to the Fintech Festival at the end of 2022, to see now how they've kind of evolved and embraced blockchain and digital assets and tokenization, and very much seeing this as, hey, is this the kind of technology that helps us solve problems around climate change and sustainability and logistics and farming and all these other things. So I absolutely love the ambition. I think the challenge that we've got in Australia is that we just don't have the kind of risk appetite for investment from the private markets. Mm-hmm. Everything's kind of, all the money's put into property and mining. And we just haven't got a strong enough kind of history of taking high risk bets. It's starting to change a bit now, but we only really had our first VC firms in 2013. So, it's only been a decade that we've seen kind of VC, and now they're starting to get fairly significant. So hopefully we'll see that type of, we'll see, kind of some of that happen. I will say that the previous government, we had a minister for fintech, and I remember she went to, the Singapore Fintech Festival as well, and could see visibly, that it had really kind of, changed her thinking. And, this Prime Minister at the time, Scott Morrison, I think he very quickly got on board with fintech as well. But we kind of, technology and innovation, from all of the governments that we've had over the last kind of 12 years or so, it's just something that they've, it feels very much like it does with banks, where it's innovation theater, and it's a lot of kind of jazz hands and, kind of, yay, we're innovating, we're going to be the best, But when it comes to putting the money into it, it's unfortunately, we don't have what Singapore has.
It sounds interesting almost. You started off by describing the banking scene in Australia being fairly advanced when it came to digital capabilities, the banks being, leading in mobile apps and mobile capabilities for the consumers. But at the same time, you're also saying that, Australia is behind when it comes to innovation compared to Singapore, etc. It's almost like a dichotomy, right, between the two.
Yeah. And look, this is the kind of issue, right, is that the government in Singapore is driving it forwards.
Yeah.
Whereas the government in Australia kind of, and I remember this, right, at the time, Scott Morrison, who was our PM, 2 weeks before he became PM, he was the treasurer, and was at a FinTech Awards night, and he was presenting the awards. And he made a statement to a room full of people who, this is 2018, 2017. So these awards, right, we're not celebrating success. We're just celebrating the fact that we're still there. We're kind of trying to have a go, right? And Scott Morrison's talking about CDR and there's big plans and their, sandbox and the restricted digital banking license. Turns this room of, kind of no hopers who haven't got two pennies to rub together, scrapping and fighting for every bit that we can get and saying, hey, I'm dependent on you to make it all happen. Now, kind of, it's great that you kind of, hey, you want to do this, but you have to put the money behind it. That intent has to be backed by, serious investment budgets and putting the money towards it. And I think, unfortunately, this is where Australia falls down. And we don't have, as I mentioned, a kind of investment community that has the appetite to invest in something like a neobank that is a decades-long play, right? Maybe it's 20 years before you're going to see a significant return because of the capital requirements that are necessary to make it work and fulfill the regulators' needs. So I think this is the kind of, the frustration with ours is that, on the one hand, we have got, we do punch above our weight, but that's very much down to, I think, the innovation and drive and spirit and entrepreneurial spirit of the people on the ground. Whereas, the kind of, the leadership, the government, etc. I think that's where we definitely need more support.
We've talked about the CDR, the Consumer Data Regulation, in several of the answers and the questions here so far today. But we haven't mentioned one big thing, which is actually if there's two forces driving this regulation in Europe specifically, it's basically, well, banking, opening up banking through things like PSD2, opening up the APIs. But the other big elephant in the room, of course, is big techs. And there's been a lot of discussion about what are the dynamics between incumbent banks, big techs, and fintechs moving forward. So how is this big tech versus banks versus government versus fintech dynamic working out in Australia today?
Yeah. So a really great question. So Apple Pay, I think there have been some big kind of fights between the big banks and Apple Pay around payment side. So essentially, the big four banks run the whole payments network here on Oz. There's one other competitor, which is a business called Cuscal, who's a client, and they're Australia's biggest kind of independent provider of payment services. And then you've got the likes of Visa and MasterCard. We've got a business, a setup which is now called Australian Payments Plus. That's basically a consortium of the big four banks and some other banks. And so they run things like FPOS, which is your debit card kind of payment service, BPay, which is online bill payments. And so there's a fair amount of change happening there. They're very, very much kind of cognizant of not only the threats of big tech, but now the threats of crypto, blockchain, and what that can potentially mean for payments and micro payments. So they've been very cognizant of the threats, but at the same time, when you have almost it's not a monopoly or a duopoly, but the big four banks have 85% of the market in Australia. When you have that amount of kind of power, it's very difficult to I call it the Kodak dilemma, right? We kind of use Kodak as an example of how they were crazy not to innovate, and they invented the digital camera and they didn't go ahead with it in the 80s. But you can imagine the CEO at the time saying, you've just invented this thing that makes the whole business irrelevant and redundant, right? Let's get another 10, 20 years out of this thing that's making us billions of dollars a year and just hide the digital camera. So I think, if you look at a business life cycle, and a CEO's incentive plan, it's very much around how do you get returns for shareholders.
Yes.
And so I think there's kind of this dilemma, the innovator's dilemma of, well, what do you do, right? Do you kind of just protect the golden goose and get some more golden eggs, or do you completely change who you are and run a risk that actually you might be wrong, right? You can't see into the future. So there's some really kind of interesting dynamics that I think are at play at the minute between big tech and, we're kind of, obviously, I'm sure it's the same where you are. Embedded finance is the big buzzword, and I'm sure we're going to hear it everywhere, Money 2020 and Cybos and everywhere else. But I think it's actually, it's kind of it's a real thing, right? And it's a real threat to the banks.
So when big techs are mentioned, and especially in the context of regulation and a fair playing field, of course, one of the things that get mentioned and one of the hype terms we hear a lot is central bank digital currencies. Seems like being a bit of an answer from a public government perspective towards the making it sure that the nation is not too dependent on certain big tech companies coming from abroad. Is this discussion happening in Australia as well? Is CBDC a thing with Australia?
So there's actually a process underway with the RBA, which is to look at a CBDC. We've seen two of the big four banks create their own stable coins and actually do transactions with them, which has been really interesting. So yeah, it's real, right? Like, I'm not a big advocate of the kind of speculative nature of crypto, but digital currencies, tokenization, these things are happening, right? They're just inevitable. Now, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, I don't know, but I'm just convinced it's inevitable. I'm sure we'll have CBDCs. I'm sure that's, in the next 10 years, there are going to be markets for that. people will be trading it just like they are with any foreign currency. And they'll, international trade will be using CBDCs rather than, SWIFT in the system that we've got right now.
I suppose from a digital currency, cryptocurrency perspective, the ups and downs of Bitcoin and related cryptocurrencies have seen the same sort of dynamic of love or hate in Australia as other parts of the world.
Yeah, look, I'm not a big, I believe in, the potential of Bitcoin, but I don't think it's going to fulfill it, unfortunately, because, the kind of speculative nature and, some of the dynamics that are now at play. I think that, the challenge that you've got, right, is that, things like Ethereum, absolutely, right? You can see that, is this going to be the operating system of the world in the future? Is kind of how I like to think of it, rather than a digital currency. But then the speculative stuff, I mean, how long will it last? Singapore, when I was there at the FinTech Festival, have been really clear. They're not interested in the speculative nature of cryptocurrencies. I think from a regulation perspective, it's, if you look at what's happening in the US, I'm sure there will be some people going to jail fairly soon, given what's going on. And it's just something that I've actually avoided with my podcast as well. So I've got a kind of blockchain sister podcast where we're focused on what's happening with the institutional and kind of real use cases of the technology, rather than the speculative nature of here's a token or NFTs or those things. I think NFTs are fantastic. I think that there's a real use case for NFTs in things like property deeds and kind of physical assets being tokenized digitally. But the speculative nature of it and the kind of collectibles thing, I'm not really kind of interested in.
You still got your monkey NFT on your mobile wallet?
No, I got rid of it. Yeah, I've got rid of it. Yeah, it's.
But you had one. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. What can I say? I went through. I like to test everything, right? I like to kind of not go down the rabbit hole, but I like to test things rather than just judge them. And I've been kind of active in the crypto space since 2017, and I think what kind of got me into it was very much what I believe Bitcoin could be. And it was interesting. I've seen an article the other day, which I actually think is a really great use case for it, which is around communities. And this article was around beef farmers and them using Bitcoin as the kind of currency, right? And it just, for me, it just makes perfect sense. And if we were going to go back to how, civilization used to be before we had big cities and industrial areas, I think, that type of kind of economic model and incentive model makes so much sense, right?
Yeah.
But I'm just not sure we're going to go back that way. And I just can't see any governments giving up control. Regardless of what people think of fiat, the world that we live in was created by fiat, so it can't be all bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody who's been listening to this podcast knows that we are a bit on the skeptical side when it comes to NFTs and crypto, especially. And I think the important thing that you mentioned there as well is that the governments would not give this control away. And that boils down to, well, then if that would happen, then that would mean that the laws of the countries where they're being used also need to change, because laws are the ones that define the structure of the country, if you will, the operating system of the country. And if somewhere they're able to find this integration between the legal system and these new crypto networks or decentralized networks, then perhaps. But before that happens, before that political will to make that happen is real, it's going to be a challenge for sure.
Yeah, but, look, if there's World War III and we destroy everything and we have to start again, let's use Bitcoin.
Maybe not.
If we destroy everything, there won't be enough IT to support it. We'll go back to seashells, right? And everything else. But we have digressed, guys. We were focused in on the fintech scene in Australia, and we're suddenly now talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. I think we need to drag ourselves out of that.
I think what's really interesting, though, right, is like I don't make a distinction between the two now. Right? I think this is something that Australia is kind of if I've got a criticism of how we've gone about kind of creating the ecosystem, and it's not, and I've got friends in all of these organizations, and I have an enormous amount of respect for the work that they do, and I'm highly supportive of it. But we've got Blockchain Australia, Fintech Australia, InsurTech Australia, RegTech Australia, DeFi Association of Australia. We've got all of these kind of like things going off and doing their own little thing, and we haven't got a big enough market, right? It's like, the members can't afford 7 memberships, right?
No.
It's kind of to represent the same thing that I'm asking all these other businesses to represent. So I think one of the things that we need to do, and the kind of the view that I've had, and I've been really fortunate, is I've been able to see across all of this, having clients in InsurTech, in RegTech, in blockchain, and for me, I just can't see now any delineation between blockchain and digital assets and payments. I think those two are going to be so intermeshed that it's kind of, I don't think we're going to use the term blockchain anymore. I don't think we're going to use the term digital assets anymore. I think it's just going to be payments, right? It's going to be, that thing of, the coin a fintech phrase, ubiquity, right? It's going to be ubiquitous. So I kind of feel that blockchain's a really important part of the fintech conversation. When we're talking about payments and things like trade finance and, those things that would really benefit from the technology. But I agree, look, the speculative nature of it is something that's just, save that for YouTube and kind of, the crypto boys and.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a really, really good statement because again, it's all about what you're actually trying to achieve, and if both the regulation and the technology focus on this activity that's being done, the end result, if you will, I think that's we're going to lead into a better place. That actually leads us into rounding off maybe the discussion a little bit here with a question that we talked about Australian fintech, we talked about regulation, we covered a lot of things already. But if you had a magic wand, basically, and you could change 1 or 2 things about the Australian fintech scene to make it better, and this could be also something that happened in the past or something that you would like to happen right now, but what would those changes be if you really had the power to make it really change, and how would that change things for the better?
2 of them that I've actually discussed already. So the first one would be the risk appetite of the investment community in Australia, and a more increased understanding as to the business models of fintech and what they're actually getting into. If we could do that, I think we would really start to kind of evolve. And then the second would be, I think, just a unified, kind of body that represents fintech in Australia, and all of these disparate groups, separate groups come together, so that we've got one voice, and we've got all of these great people kind of all in unison, moving at the same time together. I think they would be 2 things I would love to see, and I am not crazy to ever think there will be a magic wand that will make government do things differently. So I'm not going to mention government at all.
All right. So basically, risk appetite or being brave, and then consensus, I guess, or harmony in the ecosystem. Yeah, I think that's those are 2 good sentiments anywhere. I think that's a really good way of rounding it off.
Yeah.
Then finally, I do want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the podcast you mentioned. So you have a podcast called Fintech Chatter, and I heard just now that you have another one, sister podcast called Blockchain Chatter. I guess if our listeners are interested, this is the definitive source for everything in Australian fintech, and they definitely should listen. Or how would you describe the podcast for our listeners?
Yeah, look, it's probably similar to yours, right? Just conversations with people, slightly different in that, we talk a lot about entrepreneurship. We talk a lot about, things like hiring and leadership, because that's my business. So it's become a kind of a de facto archive for the Aussie fintech industry now, where we've got emerging founders who come onto the show who have used the podcast as a resource of, intelligence and insights. that are specific to Australia. So the nuances that we have in this market, if you kind of do what a fintech does in the UK or in the US and you try to apply it to this market, you're probably going to fail. And so we found that the kind of the insights that have been gleaned over these last 3 years is now this archive of the fintech ecosystem in Australia. I will say, when I was recording a podcast last night with a guest who's based in Europe, I asked them a question, which is, what are the fintech podcasts that you listen to? And they said Fintech Insider, as you might imagine. And then the second one they said was this little one from the Nordics called Fintech Daydreaming. Wow. I'm actually speaking to the guys tomorrow night. So look, I thought I would give you that bit of kudos, because I don't think there's anything better than getting feedback directly from people when they say, hey, look, I listen to your show and it actually makes a difference and it makes an impact on me. So kudos to you both. And I hope that gives you a little bit of kind of energy and to keep on doing what you're doing as well, because it's not easy. It's not easy. And to have the consistency that you've shown, it puts you in the kind of top 1%, right? Because most give up after a few episodes.
Yeah. No, I will definitely take that to heart, Ville. That's I'm blushing on the inside with pride. So thank you for that.
Yes, indeed. That's definitely the best news of the day so far for me. Maybe even the year. Okay, but again, it's small things like that really make us continue the podcast here. Like we have established many times to our listeners, we do this on our free time. We don't have any advertisers. We don't get paid by anybody to do this. So it's exactly things like this that keep us running from day to day. So thanks for that. I'll definitely have a listen with at least to that episode once it comes out.
Yeah. So it's actually with Jeff Parker, who's the head of international expansion for Marketer. So it's a great guest, great business. If you think of the caliber of that type of person that's listening to your show as well, highly relevant. I think it kind of adds a little bit extra to the kind of compliment and the recognition you've been given.
Great. I mean, season 6, episode 8, by the way, Jeff was with us as well. So I think that for anybody who wants to go back and listen to it. But look, we're almost up against it on time. Time is flying when you're having fun, like we always say in this in our podcast. Was there anything that we didn't get to cover today that you wanted to still mention today, Dexter?
The thing that I wanted to mention was just to say the great work that you're doing, and just to keep it up. I think it's amazing, right? And I've seen through my own podcast the actual difference that it makes and the impact that it has. And not many people in life get that opportunity to be able to reach as many people as you do through a podcast and kind of actually make a difference. So I just wanted to give you guys salute you both and just say thanks for keep doing what you're doing.
And the same.
We thank you. We thank you very much. Paul, anything you wanted to say before we round it off?
No, I think we're very rapidly heading towards the top of the hour and need to close out this episode. But apart from that, Dexter, it's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Guys, thanks for inviting me on. And I'd love to do this again sometime.
All right, will do. So finally, Dexter, how can our listeners get in touch with you, find more about you, or maybe find the podcast?
Yeah, best places. Well, we're on all the podcast platforms, Fintech Chatter. You can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter as Dexter Cousins. And you can go to our website for the podcast, which is fintechchatter.com.
All right. Thank you, Dexter. And again, thank you for being a guest. Fantastic to hear feedback from the audience as well. We are truly blushing inside here and have the energy to continue for as long as it takes. Let's put it that way. So thank you again, listeners, for hanging out with us for this episode of Fintech Daydreaming. We will be back in 2 weeks, as always. And always remember to subscribe, like, comment, and give feedback to us. That's also the fuel that keeps us running episode by episode. So with that being said, we thank you, goodbye, and this has been Fintech Daydreaming.
This is Fintech Daydreaming.